Welcome to Ljubljana Street Art Festival. We are very excited to be able to welcome live audience here in these hard and troubling times in Kino Šiška, and of course our followers on live stream all over the world. My name is Tjaša Poreber and I will be with you throughout today's 3 panels. And we are very happy that we are starting the first day of the International Street Art Conference, format documenting, collecting and archiving street art in theory and practice. The aim of the conference is to talk about the practices of collecting street art and in its theory and practice. The aim of the conference is to talk about the practices of collecting street art and in its very broad sense. The conference is curated by the steering committee consisting of Anja Zver, Michael Rjavec and Sandy Abram. And before we start intriguing conversations and exciting talks, we're going to hear from Sandy Abram for a short introduction.
Thank you, Tjaša. Distinguished speakers, participants and guests, on behalf of the Institute for Urban Questions and the Kino Šiška Center for Urban Culture, I bid you all a very welcome to the formal conference. I'm actually honored that we are hosting such an international landmark event in Slovenia as part of the 3rd Ljubljana Street Art Festival. As you know, and as already Tjaša explained, the Street Art Conference aims to interrogate the practices of collecting street art in their broadest sense as a preservation, conservation, and accumulation of tangible and intangible things by individuals and institutions. So the conference brings together scholars and artists with a keen interest in street art. The panels and presentations have been arranged within various sub-themes. So we'll have the wonderful opportunity to return to the roots of documenting graffiti, hear about self-archiving practices, question the ephemerality of street art, and learn how street art is archived in contested spaces. So I wish you all a great conference, enriching discussions and deep insights. And finally, also a massive thank you to all the brilliant people for their tremendous support. You have helped to make this happen. Thank you again, and a very warm welcome to the virtual and live Ljubljana. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandy. And now we are very excited to present our first keynote presenter, Peter Bengtsen. Peter is an associate professor at Lund University and an art historian and sociologist who has written extensively on the topics of graffiti and street art. His lecture today will be on the topic of different approaches to documenting and preserving graffiti and street art, despite, of course, the fact that street art and graffiti itself is all the time subject to fast changes and might, of course, be altered at any time. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I want to start by thanking you for inviting me to give this keynote talk. I'd also like to start by saying that I regret not being able to be there in person. When I was first contacted in 2019 about this keynote, the plan was for me to go to Slovenia, where I've never been. But unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, it's not really possible this year. Especially after a long period of online teaching, it would have been really nice to actually be there in person and meet all of you. But hopefully it will be possible in the future. So I've met some of the attendees, some of the people who were speaking before, but for those of you who don't know me, as was said, my name is Peter Bengtsen and I'm an art historian and sociologist, and I'm an associate professor in art history and visual studies at Lund University, which is in Sweden. And I've been writing about street art since around 2006, and in 2014 I published my first book. But before I continue, perhaps I should just bring up my presentation so that you can actually see here. Are you able to see my presentation here?
Yeah, we see it perfectly.
Excellent. So, as I was saying, I published my first book in 2014. It was called The Street Art World. It was sort of a broad overview of what street art is and how it relates to public space, how it relates to public art, and how it relates to the art market, amongst other things. And that was followed in 2018 by my second book, which is called Street Art and the Environment. which looks at the different ways that street art and graffiti can influence the way we think about environmental issues. So in addition to these books, I've also, as was said, published a number of articles and book chapters and essays, and most are freely available on my academia page. And I can post a link in the Zoom chat after the talk to that page and to other sites that might be of interest. My current research focuses not so much on street art, but more on graffiti, specifically how outsiders like myself can gain an understanding of a particular local graffiti world by studying the visual materials that it produces. I should mention I'm not a street artist, I'm not a graffiti writer, I haven't engaged in those practices myself, I just study them. So in that sense, I am an outsider to the field. Apart from my own research, I'm also one of the founders and coordinators of the interdisciplinary research network Urban Creativity Lund. And Alexander Paulsen, who will be presenting a paper tomorrow, is also a member of this group. Urban Creativity Lund started as an 8-month project at the Pufendorf Institute for Advanced Studies at Lund University. And it's focused on urban creativity broadly. So not just graffiti and street art, but also, for example, skating and parkour and guerrilla gardening and so on. So we're an interdisciplinary network of researchers focusing on different practices and phenomena that have the potential to push legal, moral, and cultural boundaries by exploring alternative ways of using and understanding the city. And we've been on a bit of a hiatus since the COVID pandemic hit last year, but we're looking to start up our Urban Creativity Seminar again in the fall. So if anyone is interested in talking to us or perhaps attending or presenting at these seminars, please don't hesitate to get in touch. When speaking of urban creativity, I feel like I should also just mention that I have recently taken on the role as a co-editor of the journal Street Art and Urban Creativity, which was started by Pedro Suarez Neves in 2015. And we currently have an open call for submissions to the journal. The link is on the slide here. I can also share it on the Zoom chat afterwards, and perhaps someone can share it on the YouTube page as well. And you're also welcome again to contact me directly if you want the call for submissions. The journal is strongly associated with the annual Urban Creativity Conference in Lisbon that is also arranged by Pedro. And I know that some of you have already attended and presented at this conference in the past. And this year, like last year, the conference will take place online, and you can see the program and sign up to attend via the second link in the slide, which again, I'm happy to share after the talk. Okay, so after this brief introduction about myself and some of the activities that I'm engaged in, let's move on to the topic of today's talk. So in keeping with the overarching theme of the conference, in my talk this afternoon, I'm going to discuss how we might think about the documentation and preservation of graffiti and street art. In doing so, I'm going to highlight some of the advantages and some of the problems that come with documenting and preserving ephemeral expressions. There are, of course, many different means of documentation and preservation. And my goal here is not to give an exhausting account, also exhausting perhaps, but exhaustive account of all of them. Rather, I'm going to introduce some general thoughts on the topic of documentation and preservation that I hope may lead to further discussion in the question and answer session later on and also during the rest of the conference, of course. From what I can see in the program, many of the approaches and practices that I will mention in this talk are also going to be discussed in greater detail in other papers later on. So I aim here to sort of create a broad entrance to the papers that are going to be presented later on and the themes that we're going to engage with. So to start us off, I will begin with the observation that in the past 20 years or so, street-based expressions like graffiti and street art have increasingly become a pervasive part of visual culture and many people's daily lives. These types of expressions, and especially street art, have also become increasingly accepted as valid and valuable cultural utterances and have gradually become institutionalized, thereby arguably becoming something other than graffiti and street art, including vehicles for commercialization and gentrification. Street art tours and the so-called street art festivals that now exist in many cities also contribute to people's exposure to graffiti and street art, or at least to expressions that aesthetically reference graffiti and street art, as well as to other forms of urban creativity. The pervasiveness of these types of expressions can then be observed in our physical environments in urban settings and beyond, but also via different types of documentation and mediation, including in printed publications and perhaps especially on social media. Indeed, the emergence of digital technologies for recording images, the Web 2.0 and social media from the late 1990s onwards has played a crucial role in the popularization of street-based expressions. And while graffiti and street art can be found in pretty much any urban environment, some places are known as particular hotspots and attract large audiences. And in the slide seen here is one example, which is a crowded Hosier Lane in Melbourne, Australia. By their very nature, these well-visited hotspots are also good places to observe the engagement with and the incessant documentation of street-based expressions that is taking place. Documentation efforts that, as mentioned previously, to a large degree have exploded because of the emergence of convenient, intuitive, and affordable digital image making and image sharing technologies. With a growing tendency to document street-based expressions, it's worth considering what it means to document graffiti and street art. What is it that we're documenting? What is it that we're preserving? What is the result of this documentation and preservation that we're conducting? And what aspects of the work are we able to capture with different approaches to documentation and preservation? So by way of background, when considering these questions, it's useful to mention here that I have identified in my work 3 central characteristics of graffiti and street art. These types of expressions are, to my mind, open, unsanctioned, and ephemeral. That graffiti and street art are open means that in principle anyone can participate by creating, altering, or removing work. Of course, it entails certain risks, but in principle anyone can do it. You don't need to ask for permission in order to do it. And that ties in with it being unsanctioned, of course, meaning you don't have to ask, or you don't ask permission when you make these works, you just go out and do it. What it means is also that these works are created without permission, or rather are perceived as having been made without permission. Perceived because for the random passerby, it might not be immediately obvious whether a certain work has actually been created with permission or not. So it's the perceived status of the work that is important here. I also just want to briefly note that there's a difference between something being unsanctioned and something being illegal. It's fully possible to create unsanctioned work in public space without breaking any laws. And then finally, as I mentioned, graffiti and street art, to my mind, are also ephemeral, which means that they're not intended or expected to last a long time. I won't go into further detail about these characteristics here, but it's something we can return to in the Q&A if anybody wants to. But instead, I'm just going to note that these characteristics mean that expressions like graffiti and street art tend to be rather short-lived, even though there are, of course, examples and exceptions where works have lasted for decades. But this general short-livedness is important for the topic at hand because the frequent removal and alteration, along with the ongoing decay of works due to a lack of, typically, of a conservation plan, means that documentation will often quickly be all that we're left with of a given work. This fact and the related perceived importance of documenting individual works is often used when justifying what is probably the most invasive method for documenting and ostensibly preserving graffiti and street art, namely the physical removing of works from the street. As is likely well known to many of you, the rise in value and popularity of some artists' commercial output has meant that their works in the street are increasingly being removed with a view to collect or sell. And a prominent example of this is the work by the British artist Bankston. And as you may have seen in the program, there's going to be a screening and a discussion of Marco Prosepio's film on this very topic on Thursday. In this slide is one of the latest examples of a decontextualized Banksy street work, the so-called hula hoop girl that was painted in Nottingham in October 2020. The work was quickly covered in acrylic glass and was then cut out of the wall in February 2021. But what is really preserved when decontextualizing works in this way? In the case at hand, the stencil painting gets a significant part of its meaning from the immediate as well as the wider context. The hula hoop in the image here is in fact a bicycle tire, which directly connects the stencil painting to the chained up bicycle on the sidewalk that is missing its back wheel. As a side note, I can just say that the bicycle actually was removed pretty quickly. It was already removed in November 2020, a few months before the rest of the work disappeared. As for the wider context, it's worth noting that the stencil painting was created near the old Raleigh factory in Nottingham, which of course also adds meaning and site specificity to the work. And here is an image of the stencil painting after it had been cut out from the wall. What is preserved here is arguably a physical sample that could allow viewers to study Banksy's technique from a material perspective, just like we're able to, as art historians, to study classical paintings, for instance, and look at the materials that were used. The same thing would be possible with a preserved sample like this one. However, while the stencil painting itself has been preserved and can be studied, the context has, of course, been lost here. And as argued previously, this context was important for the meaning of the work. Of course, it's to some extent possible to offer insights into the original context of works that have been removed in this way through visual documentation of the work in its original site and by writing about the wider context the work was embedded in. But engaging with the work in this way as a viewer, I think, is still very different from actually experiencing the work in its original site. The perception of the removed work is also affected by the issue of private ownership. While the physical work in situ is also someone's property, often it will be the building owner, but it really depends on the specific work and the materials that are used. It's frequently perceived as belonging to the public. So even though it's owned by somebody technically, it's seen as belonging to the public. And I want to emphasize that when I talk about ownership here, I'm talking specifically about ownership of the physical work, because the immaterial rights, including the right to reproduce the image, is a more complex issue, and Enrico Bonadio will be discussing this further tomorrow. So once removed, the work becomes a decontextualized object that is very clearly claimed as someone's private property, even though it's not always transparent whose property it actually is. And in virtue of this process, the work ceases to be part of the common. And this is one reason that many street art aficionados tend to see this type of removal as something negative. Another is the fact that works like these are arguably site-specific and thus are conceptually broken once they are removed from their original site. And this, along with a reluctance to further potential personal financial gain of those removing the works, is also why many artists will not authenticate removed street works. When I was conducting research for my first book, where I also write about some of these things, the negative attitude towards these types of removals without the original artist's blessing among members of what I call the street art world was quite prevalent. But in recent years, a more nuanced view, or varied view perhaps, on the practice seems to have emerged. And this was also seen in a recent, unscientific but still interesting poll conducted by Jasper van Es on Instagram. And I know that he will be speaking later today. So the poll was conducted on Instagram stories and related to images of decontextualized graffiti on show at Palette Tokyo in Paris. And as you can see, the vote on whether this decontextualization of graffiti was good or bad was split almost 50-50, with just a slight leaning towards the negative. Now, while we can't say that this is representative of anything other than this specific poll among a very particular group of Instagram users, and we cannot draw any grand conclusion from the results, I think that it's still worth reflecting on, because this 47 to 53% ratio would not be the case 10 years ago when I was conducting my study on street art forums. To the end of reflecting further on this, I also found it interesting that this response was posted to Instagram, commenting on the results of the poll it's a post by Loic, whose excellent graffiti tips scene you should check out if you haven't already. It's a really good publication. On the one hand, you can see from his Instagram story that he voted that this removal and use of graffiti was bad. But then on the other hand, Loic then found it okay to help a friend decontextualize graffiti on a construction site fence and notes that it's a fine line, this issue of removal and when it's okay, when it's good, when it's bad. It's a fine line. It's difficult to define clearly. And I would agree with that position. It is indeed a fine line. And I suppose central questions when it comes to removals are, what are we actually trying to achieve by removing a work from its original location? What are we preserving if we're trying to preserve something and not just trying to enrich ourselves? Is it the original expression created on the street by a particular artist or writer that we're trying to preserve? And if so, does removal actually achieve this? Or does it conversely destroy the work? Or perhaps the decontextualization entails the creation of a new work that simply uses the original expression as its artistic material. And if that's the case, what implications does this have for our documentation and preservation effort? The notion that we may be creating a new artwork through decontextualization has been addressed in a series of works by Brad Downey that contain what is described as original Banksy materials. These were taken from a gallery context rather than from the street, it should be noted. And here, the buffed and cut-out paintings of Banksy are reworked using hyperspectral imaging and framed as not being by Banksy, but rather being by Downey. So that's one way to approach this type of removal of another artist's work, by claiming it as your own, not claiming anymore that it's a Banksy work, but rather that it's the work of the person who has decontextualized it. Since the context of the street is arguably very important for a lot of the expressions that are found there, I think it's necessary to consider carefully what aspects of a work are actually being preserved when a decontextualization takes place. This is true not just when considering physically removing an artwork, but also when deciding what kind of restoration and conservation efforts are subsequently going to be used on the removed object, if any. A problem with the argument that decontextualized works can afford insight into the material aspects of an artistic process is that such works are often restored, for instance, by repainting portions or removing tags or other expressions not considered part of the work under preservation. And this to the point where it can be difficult to see the material properties of the original work. In the case of the removal of Banksy's hula hoop girl and other cases like it, I think the problems of decontextualization are quite clear. Looking at the image of the work in situ, the one on the right here, it's also clear that photography has the advantage of being a clearly less invasive method than physical removal for documenting and preserving a record of a street work. However, it's worth noting that photos of work in situ also invariably entails cropping. Unlike, for example, artworks that are made on canvas and are created for the art market, which tend to have very well-defined boundaries, the dimensions of a given work in the street are unclear. How much space on either side of the stencil painting should be included in order to fairly represent the work? What about the parts of the environment that are behind the photographer or just around the corner? In other words, how much context is enough when documenting a street work? It's also clear that some material aspects which may be observed in physical works, whether decontextualized or preserved in situ, can be difficult to fully document through photography. This can to some extent be remedied by creating series of photos, perhaps combining wider shots with close-ups and even macro shots. But there is still, I think, a tangibility to the physical works that is difficult to replicate in the smooth surface of a photograph, whether it be on actual photo paper, in print, or on a screen. On the flip side, the use of techniques like macro photography or hyperspectral imaging may enable us to see aspects of the work that the naked eye cannot, even if we're standing right in front of the actual physical work. While this talk so far has mainly focused on what is perceived as individual finished works, graffiti and street art are at least as much about processes of initial creation, of alteration, and of deterioration. And in relation to a specific work or area, longitudinal or repeat photography, where the same wall or work is photographed repeatedly over time, can help to document these processes. In the slide that you see here, there's an example from my first book. It's a paste up by the Danish artist Armstrong from Copenhagen. And the three photos that you see here were taken at intervals of 6 months. So the first photo was taken shortly after the paste up was first put on the street. The second photo was taken after half a year, and the third photo was taken half a year after that. So 1 year after the piece first went up. And you can clearly see the deterioration process here. As can be seen, since the work was made on a paper base, it deteriorated over time. And this deterioration is a natural part of the life cycle of street art, of course. And it's something that can quite effectively be captured through longitudinal or repeat photographic documentation. Also, since street works tend to change over time, photographic documentation can facilitate having a discussion about a specific work, or rather, photographic documentation can ensure that all participants are discussing a work at a specific stage of development. This is useful when having conversations about a work which different people may see at different times and therefore in different states, and therefore have completely different impressions about. But if we have a photo that shows it in a particular state, then we can have a conversation based on that rather than just on our individual experiences of the physical work. Another approach to documenting is videography, and this is something I've been experimenting with recently in relation to specifically graffiti tagging. While the serial nature of tagging can to some extent be shown through photography, videography is better suited to provide a sense of the relationship between tags. By depicting the routes along which tags are found, videography can offer some insight into the tags and serial nature, not just spatially, but also temporally. Videography makes it possible to depict separate instances of tagging in physical space, as well as convey in real time to the viewer how long it takes to move between them. With the right equipment, it's also possible to create 360-degree videos that show even more of the surrounding environment that can actually give you more of an idea of the milieu that the graffiti appears in. Likewise, virtual reality and or augmented reality has, I think, great potential in relation to documenting and preserving records of graffiti and street art. And here I'm not talking about the often rather gimmicky use of these technologies to, for example, animate and expand an existing mural as seen in this image. Rather, I think a particular strength of these technologies is the possibility of creating a timeline and making visible different layers of expressions that are no longer actually available to see on the street. This, of course, requires previous visual documentation of the elements that one wishes to include in this timeline. I must admit that I'm not all too familiar with virtual reality and augmented reality myself. I haven't worked with it, but I'm aware of a few research projects that work with or aim to work with this type of technology. And I believe that Liliana Radosevic will be speaking about this on Thursday. It's of course also possible to combine many different approaches to visual documentation and to add written accounts to further deepen the narratives. This is something that practitioners of graffiti and street art have been doing for a long time. In the beginning in scenes and on VHS tapes, as well as more professional publications, and now I would say chiefly through social media, even though the scene culture is of course alive and well. This self-archiving or self-chronicling is very important, I think, since graffiti and street art are not just about a visual end product, but at least as much about the practices behind the things, the activities that lead to the things that we see on the street. And I believe that this will be discussed further in a panel later today, which will include Good Guy Boris's recent travel and documentation project that takes place on multiple platforms, including, as you can see in this Instagram story, including on OnlyFans. So even though we today have unprecedented means of documenting and broadcasting graffiti and street art, there are some aspects of these practices and expressions that are difficult or perhaps impossible to adequately document. In my first book, I read about discovering this stencil painting by Bast in Bushwick in New York, and how the discovery and experience of the work became all the more meaningful because I had to explore an unknown area in the sweltering New York City summer heat before I eventually found the painting. The feeling of being lost and tired, the heat and sun on my skin, the thirst, the aching feet, the sounds and smells of the urban environment. These are just some of the tangible aspects of experiencing graffiti and street art that I believe cannot be wholly communicated through documentation. And those who are familiar with my work will know that I see this element of exploration and bodily engagement with the urban environment as a vital part of the artistic and social value of graffiti and street art. So to round off here as a final point, I think it's important to emphasize that even though all documentation methods have their shortcomings, and even though when combining them, there will still be aspects of experiencing graffiti and street art that we can't fully capture, documentation is immensely important. As a researcher, I rely not just on my own, but as can be seen from my use of screen grabs in this presentation, also the documentation efforts of other people. And I believe this to be the case to varying degrees for basically all researchers. Documentation is also important because our visual literacy develops over time. Personally, I find it invaluable to be able to go back and look at details I missed when first documenting a work, to go back in my archives and look at images again, or to revisit works I couldn't initially decipher. This is especially the case with graffiti, but that I have later been able to connect to other more legible expressions. And this is of course only possible because I, as well as others, have initially documented the works in question. So while perhaps not perfect, I think that documentation is absolutely vital. And I look forward to hearing the presentations in the rest of the conference and seeing what discussions we can have on this topic. With that, I will end.
Peter, thank you very much for this very interesting insight into documenting street art and graffiti. At this point, of course, I would like to open the floor for any kind of questions that there might be. For in terms of live audience, I will repeat for the live streaming your questions, but feel free to ask them as you are. Just show your hand, and I will give you the word. And of course, the same goes for people watching us on YouTube. So if there are any questions, please let us know. Otherwise, I have, of course, a question for you, Peter. Before we go into longer and deeper context of your talk, I am actually interested about the methodology of your research, because you've mentioned in the beginning that you position yourself as an outsider, as someone who is not himself a practitioner of street art or graffiti art. What kind of problems do you have with positioning yourself outside of this sphere, or rather do you see as a researcher also some pluses perhaps in being outside and just documenting and researching graffiti and street art from this position?
Yeah, so there are two separate answers to that, because my position with regards to street art, the street art world is different from my position with regard to the local graffiti world in Malmö here in Sweden, where I live. In terms of street art, I'm probably more of an insider, even though I don't create street art myself. Before I even began my research, I was a member of different forums for people who were interested in street art, and a lot of my empirical data is derived from these forums. So there, I think I was probably more of an insider into the street art world. But in terms of graffiti, I'm absolutely an outsider. I moved to Malmö in 2010 to pursue my PhD at Lund University, and so I'm Danish originally. I'm not Swedish, which means that I didn't know anyone here, and I didn't know any graffiti writers. I was not part of that environment at all. Over the years, of course, and especially through the use of social media, I have met different writers here, and I probably could have become more of an insider. But I've chosen to limit my in-person engagement with the writers precisely because I think there's an advantage to being an outsider. So my current research is very much about what can be, what information, what knowledge can be elicited from just from the visual expressions that are available, that derive from the graffiti world, the local graffiti world that I'm studying, which is the world here in Malmö and surrounding areas. So Skåne, Scania, southern Sweden. And I find that this position is beneficial in part because it sets me apart from some of my colleagues here in Sweden who are very much insiders and who have, of course, access to different types of knowledge. But being forced to just look at the visual expressions puts me in the same position as well, in principle, anyone else who would come across these expressions in the street and who would have an interest in them. That's how I started out. Of course, now I've been doing it for 10 years. I've been studying these expressions and documenting them. So now, when I see a tag by a particular writer, I can immediately connect it to a bunch of other expressions by the same crew or writer. And so I'm not a novice in the same way that people, random people in the street would be, but it still puts me in a position apart from the social environment, and I find that very interesting. So I do see it as a strength, but of course there are also drawbacks to it. There are many things that I'm not privy to that my colleagues know about. Because they are actually engaging with the writers.
Thank you, Peter. Sandy is on YouTube asking, first of all, thanking you for the interesting talk, highlighting the fact that here in Slovenia, in Ljubljana, we have a local researcher, Monika Kropej, who used rephotography as a medium to research the political confrontations on the walls. And he has a question for you. He would like to ask if there are any good practices to share our archives for research purposes.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
I think that what he is interested in is whether or not you are familiar with some good practices on how to share archives for research purposes. So I would say personal archives. Okay.
Yeah. No, I can't say that I am, not in any systematic way. The way I have access to I mean, there are archives. I know there's a big archive in Berlin. I'm not sure that it's digitized though, and I know that there are you know, all of us who are conducting research have these archives, but in many cases I think that they're not systematized. I know mine isn't. When I started photographing graffiti over here, I didn't tag my photos, which means that, I mean, they're ordered after the years that they have been created and the months and the dates, but I don't have any way of searching them. And at first that was fine, but now it's becoming a problem because I have, you know, like tens of thousands of photos, of course, and so I'm not really, I don't think I'm the right person to ask about these archival methods because I'm not very good at it myself. But of course I would encourage people to share their material as much as possible. But at the same time, like, you also have to be careful what you share because not all writers want their work to be shared openly. Recently I posted on Instagram a work by a whole train by a specific writer here, and I got a message pretty quickly asking me to take it down because that person didn't want it shared. And of course that was possible because he could get directly in touch with me, but if other people had access to my archive, that might not have been such a simple process. So there are definitely, as I see it, some difficulties in sharing this material openly.
You were talking about the hotspots being, of course, a good starting place to start documentation and so on. And you've also mentioned the use of contemporary new technologies and, of course, in connection with the social media. Now, that being said, if we pair this fact with the increasing gentrification, touristification of many cities all over the world, we, of course, very fastly encounter a sort of commodification problem where this increased documentation of street art and graffiti, actually documentation by individuals who are just visiting the place perhaps, actually contributes to not just commodification of the street art piece itself, but also towards gentrification of the area that has many negative impacts. So I would really like to hear perhaps some thoughts, if you have, to that kind of, to the consequences of that kind of perhaps unintended or non-curated documentation of street art.
Yeah, I think it's a huge problem, and I don't really think that there's an easy solution to it, because you can't really control what individuals post on their social media accounts, and of course, the more people post something from Post Your Lane or perhaps East London or Williamsburg yeah, there are many different places like this where street art and to some extent also graffiti is being used as a vehicle for gentrification, and where the individuals posting of these visual expressions certainly play into that. I'm not sure that we can do much about it. At least I don't really see how that would be possible. But what we can do as researchers is we need to be very careful about how we contribute to this. And I think that it's also a matter of artists, perhaps, taking a more critical approach to how they place their work and how they engage in these processes of gentrification. Because, I mean, while some artists are very conscious about this and deliberately try to undermine these processes, there are others who seem to be happy with, well, going along with basically anything as long as they get their profile raised and perhaps make some money from it. And I think that's you know, that's a problem for urban space.
If there are any questions from our live audience here, otherwise I still have one more. Okay, so you spoke very extensively about the methodology of documenting. You spoke about the removals that are usually in violation with the authors. You spoke about the photography that perhaps can contextualize a little bit better the art piece itself. And of course, you spoke about the new approaches, VR and so on, and also videography. But my question is, and I would like to perhaps give you at the end a little bit space about that, to speak about that, is you know, the question that you actually posed in the beginning of your talk, and that is, why are we documenting? Why do we want to preserve something that is in itself very tangible and done in a way with the knowledge that it will not last forever? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's in our nature to collect. So I think, I mean, for my own part, when I go out documenting, it's like adding to my collection, my collection of visual material. I think it's a fundamental part of our nature to collect stuff. And if it's something that is uncollectible, to some people that just makes it even more interesting. And so there's a sort of a contradiction there, or a dilemma there. But if we're talking about why we should document these things, then, I mean, documenting is one thing, collecting the physical samples is another. As I mentioned, I think that it's quite important that we continue to document through non-invasive methods. Because there's a lot. I mean, the whole history that is taking shape on the streets. A lot of it would be lost if it's not documented. And a lot of it is lost, of course, because not everything is documented. And that's another question that is interesting: what is actually being documented, what isn't, and why? But when it comes to the removals, my position from the beginning was that it's absurd to decontextualize these works, take them out of their proper site where they were intended to be, in order to very often just see them go into the inventory of some gallery or disappear into a private collection. I do see some advantages to preserving samples of physical samples of works, as long as they're available to the public. But very often they're not, and as long as if they have been restored, it has been done in a very conscious manner. But I'm not, on the whole, I'm still quite skeptical to it, because I don't think there is a best practice for doing this. And I think that if we're going to say that these decontextualizations are a benefit, then I think that a best practice has to be established. Is there anything else I wanted to add there?
I think that maybe that is a very good place to end. Peter, thank you very much for this really inspiring talk. I think that you gave us a lot of food for thought for future debate, and I hope, of course, that you'll stay with us through the rest of the conference. As a matter of fact, we are taking a very short break right now. We're going to start at 5 o'clock sharp on the second link that you can find on Street Art Festival Ljubljana's Instagram and website. And we are very excited that we'll be joined by Marta Cooper and in conversations with Mitja Velikonia. So stay with us. We're going to be back in 10 minutes.